When lawmakers returned to the Georgia state capitol in January, they found many things just as they left them.
A Republican trifecta in control of state government, largely unchanged margins in the House and Senate, and the same roster of GOP leaders at the helm.
The state of our state is not only strong, it is resilient.
But the nation was on the verge of extraordinary upheaval. President Donald Trump was preparing to return to the White House after sweeping every battleground state, including Georgia.
Georgia Republicans felt emboldened. Democrats were grappling with a way forward. The 2026 elections seemed just around the corner.
As the 2025 Georgia General Assembly came to a close last Friday night, this political climate helped fuel tensions and shape many of the sharpest debates at the Capitol.
Mr. Speaker, I move that this House stand adjourned, sine die.
On the motion, this House stands adjourned, sine die.
While relations between Democrats and Republicans frayed as the session went on.
So I just use this bill as another example, ladies and gentlemen, of how we are just a trained monkey could vote yes or no. We don't need to come down here for that.
Conflict also flared between Republicans in the House and the Senate.
The Senate has checked all their political priorities and decided to end their night early.
I don't tell the House how to run their chamber, and they don't tell me how to run mine.
On today's episode, what the legislative priorities, strategy, messaging, and points of conflict during the 2025 legislative session illuminate about Georgia politics. I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas, and this is Plugged In from WABE.
All right, Sam, we've had a week to recover. How you feeling?
I am so happy it is over. I am feeling amazing, Rahul.
You know, Sam, last week took a lot out of me. Normally, I'm right back at the Capitol right after sine die. I still haven't been back yet, so...
I think that seems very healthy. Okay, I want to dig into some of the big themes that I'm taking away from this 40-day session, which wrapped up last Friday night. But first, can we just talk about how that night went down? I mean, House Speaker John Burns said he'd never seen anything like it. Rahul, you've been around the block for a few sessions. Had you seen anything like this?
Not really, Sam. You know, Friday was a really long day. I got to the Capitol, I think around 7:30 that morning. Senate and House budget riders met at 8 o'clock. That's why I was there so early. They were there to agree on the 2026 state budget. No real surprise there. And then, bang, Governor Kemp calls a bill signing on 30 minutes notice. And in this case, it was Senate Bill 36, the Georgia Religious Freedom Restoration Act, also known as RFRA. So that was kind of our first surprise of the day. You know, then we kind of got into the day, bills getting passed, being sent back and forth between the House and Senate. You know, a lot of talking to lawmakers and lobbyists and advocates. And then suddenly, and I mean, it really was suddenly, the state Senate came to a stop and adjourned before the normal midnight deadline. And there were Senate bills still sitting over in the House.
Okay, yeah, so just to fill in what we're talking about here, the House did not vote on several controversial Senate bills. And sometimes it's just as important to look at what did not pass a session as what did. So let's talk about some of these things that we've been talking about that did not end up passing. These include Senate bills to restrict puberty blockers for minors experiencing gender dysphoria, a bill to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum in schools, and another to remove Georgia from ERIC, which is this multi-state collaborative to keep voter lists accurate. A push to roll back state regulations inspired by billionaire Elon Musk, and a bill to punish localities that don't assist with immigration enforcement. Those also did not advance. And when all of these bills stalled, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones kind of abruptly adjourned around 9 p.m.
Ayes clearly have it. We're sine die.
Sam, let me tell you, lawmakers in both parties, on both sides of the Capitol, were really taken aback. I mean, I'm a traditionalist. I mean, some of the things that normally people do, ripping up, enough paper to throw in the air. There was only a little bit of paper thrown in the air when Burt Jones gavelled out. The thanking of staffs. You know how they say, hey, thank you to the press staff and our assistants. That was barely even done. Look, I had wandered over to the House at that moment because they were debating a bill on school zone traffic cameras, something we've done a lot of coverage on. And it was that moment that the Senate, gavelled out. That was the moment the House was amending legislation to reform those cameras. Obviously, in the end, that didn't happen. Speaker Burns and his staff and House leadership, they were scrambling to figure out what the House could still do once they realized that the Senate was out.
Yeah, so just to put a finer point on that, the House is amending something. There's no one to receive it, to send it back for final passage. So, you could kind of tell that Speaker Burns was mad when he was up there at the rostrum trying to sort all of this out. And then he spoke to reporters after.
I just think it shows that the House is focusing on its priorities of getting the job done. And we're not worried about moving on to some other higher office.
A not-so-subtle dig there, Rahul, at the Senate, where Burt Jones is expected to launch a campaign for governor later this year.
So, Sam, we headed downstairs to where Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones's office is, and he spoke to a group of reporters after gaveling out.
Hey, how's everybody?
And so Jones told us that, they got all of their priorities done, and there was no reason to stay all the way to midnight.
That means whatever doesn't get done this year will be available exactly where it sits for next year. There's no need to be in a rush to try to get bills hammered through in one year of a biennial.
Jones also told us there was no bad blood in reaction to what Burns said across the Capitol in the House. I did ask him about making a decision on running in 2026, but, he really didn't want to go there.
Rahul, there was at least one piece of legislation that kind of represented this House-Senate dynamic that you've been following really closely. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, Sam, we're talking about Senate Bill 244. It started as a Republican-backed proposal that would compensate the legal fees of defendants if the district attorney in their case was disqualified and the case itself was dismissed. The most notable example involves the Fulton County election interference case of President Donald Trump and his co-defendants, as District Attorney Fani Willis has been disqualified from that case. Well, that Republican-backed Senate legislation was combined with a bipartisan House bill that would replace the current legislative process of compensating the wrongfully convicted. It would bring in a new process involving an expert panel with a set amount of $75,000 for each year in prison. As you may have heard during last week's show, when this legislation was in the House, there was real frustration from Democrats with these two bills being combined. Well, when Senate Bill 244 went back to the Senate, that frustration was repeated there as well. Here's Democratic Senator Rashawn Kemp.
I understand some people have allegiance to the president, and some people voted for him, and that is your right. But do not force my constituents to pay his legal fees and those who tried to break the law along with him.
And Sam, I should make clear that all Republicans are not on board with this proposed new process around compensating the wrongfully convicted, even if they did vote for it. Here's Republican Senator Randy Robertson.
So understand, if anybody in this state is innocent and they're convicted, we should make sure that we take care of them. We should make sure they have due process, but we need to do it the right way.
So, Sam, a little context here. There are some Republican state senators who believe it is the responsibility of the legislature to retry these cases. There are some that believe there should be more rules, including considering someone's criminal history beyond the crime that was in question, Sam. There are also lawmakers who believe that local prosecutors and local police forces responsible for wrongful conviction, they should pay, not the state.
Okay, so someone I'm curious to hear from in this debate is Democratic State Representative Scott Holcomb, because he's been really the driving force over so many sessions of trying to get this compensation for the wrongfully convicted done. And I imagine this must have been an emotional moment when it finally ended up headed to the governor's desk.
It was, Sam. And when this was on the Senate floor for final passage, standing in the back of the Senate chamber was State Representative Scott Holcomb, along with Republican State Representative Katie Dempsey, who was the co-sponsor of that legislation. Right after that vote, they stepped out into the hallway, and here's what he had to say.
I'm very grateful that the Senate passed this measure. It's been a long time coming. And while I appreciate some of the statements that were made in the well, by Senator Robertson. I would also add that this process is, in fact, an outstanding new procedure for the state to handle wrongfully convicted compensation claims. Most importantly, for the citizens of our state, is this bill requires that an individual demonstrate innocence. And on a personal level, this will give hope to real people whose lives were devastated and destroyed by a wrongful conviction, and it gives them a path to get some measure of compensation so they can restart their lives.
Sam, I don't think the legislative fight over the issue of compensating the wrongfully convicted is over at all. And assuming the governor signs this legislation, the other half of the bill, which could compensate President Trump and his Fulton County co-defendants, that's going to be front and center in the news as well, Sam.
That segues us nicely into the first theme from the session that I want to talk about. We're going to zoom out and talk about some big picture themes. And theme number one is efforts by Republicans to mirror President Donald Trump.
Sam, there were a number of bills filed that had the fingerprints of the Trump world or the MAGA world, whatever you want to call it, including the one we were just talking about, and that could result in helping pay for Trump's Fulton County legal bills.
Yeah, and this is something that I first started noticing, Rahul, at the very beginning of session with all the press conferences about girls' sports and efforts to prohibit transgender girls from playing on girls' school sports teams. Well, there was this one week where House Speaker John Burns, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, they both had press conferences that were very high profile to introduce this policy priority. And then they both, in between, went to the White House where President Donald Trump was having a similar ceremony to sign an executive order on this topic. And that, to me, really kind of illuminated this mirroring of policy between the White House and Republicans in the Georgia state legislature. And then we continued to see this as the session went on. There was a resolution in the Senate to commend Trump, and it just went on from there.
And Sam, there was also the proposal to eliminate the state income tax on tips. There was Lieutenant Governor Jones's Red Tape Rollback Act, which he tied to the efforts of Trump and billionaire Elon Musk to slash the federal government.
And then I also want to note one other interesting example of this mirroring, and that was the debate over making an America First Georgia license plate, which passed, and of course is a slogan that was popularized by President Trump. Here's Republican Representative Martin Momtahan talking about this on the House floor.
It says, I believe in this land's promise, I believe in its people, and I believe in America First.
But Democrats also talked about the origins of this slogan, during the early 20th century amid rising nativism, anti-Semitism, and the Jim Crow era. And Representative Inga Willis, a Democrat, recounted an experience she had with her family driving to the airport at night when she was 6.
And seeing the Ku Klux Klan for the first time hooded, and him saying, get down, to my mother and I. And for the first time seeing fear in my hero's eyes.
So, this became a really fascinating discussion where you had Republicans and Democrats each talking about how they see the American dream almost and what America First means to them. Anyway, to get more broadly back to this discussion about mirroring President Trump, I think it'll be interesting, Rahul, as we look ahead to 2026 and the next legislative session, closer to an election, whether we can continue to see this trend of Georgia Republicans kind of hitching their wagons to the president.
Okay, Sam, let's take a break here. And when we come back, we'll talk about some more themes from the legislative session. This is Plugged In from WABE. Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE. Okay, so we've been talking about some big picture takeaways from the legislative session. Sam, let's dig into another big theme. The GOP really continued to emphasize culture battles, and Democrats were trying to figure out a way to respond, Sam.
I think the best way into this is to look at the bill banning gender-affirming medical treatments for state prison inmates. In the Senate, we saw some Democrats actually vote yes on this bill, but then over in the House, the whole caucus almost walked out in protest. And so I think in this particular bill, we're starting to see some of the different ways that Democrats are trying to both grapple with this particular issue, bills that affect transgender Georgians that Republicans have increasingly been pushing over the last several sessions and came back in a big way this session, but also how Democrats are just trying to respond to this political moment more broadly, as we hear from some within the party that they want to see more fight, standing up against Republicans, standing up against Trump. And I think we saw that kind of emphasized in this walkout. But I think it's still an open question, Rahul, whether Democrats have really reached a strategy that can work for how to push back on some of these bills and also how to message them to the public. And I think we might not have a good answer about that until we get closer to the next election.
We saw a slightly different approach, across the Capitol over in the Senate when that DEI legislation came up that would ban the use of DEI inside of schools. When it was in the Senate, Democrats, tried a number of motions to kind of basically gum up the works. They did like a motion to table, a motion to adjourn. They tried to put 20 amendments on the bill.
And we should say, though, that while these efforts got attention, they were not successful in stopping any of this legislation that was being protested for the most part. In the Senate, the DEI bill, it did pass the Senate. It was never picked up in the House. But in the chambers where these protests happened, they weren't able to stop the legislation they were trying to stop.
Let's hit another theme, Sam.
Okay, theme 3. Some had really high hopes for a law on school safety following the Appalachia High School shooting last year. And that bill did get across the finish line, but not everyone is totally satisfied. House Speaker John Burns did get this massive bipartisan bill done. It had a lot of what he wanted, but not everything.
Sam, early on, I had already started hearing a big point of contention that could trip up the legislation was the database to share information about, student behavior and threats among schools and state agencies. There were concerns from all sides about privacy, about racial profiling, and in the end, it really was a sticking point.
Yeah, in the final version of the bill, this database, which was kind of a core of the legislation, did not end up being part of the final bill. I heard from folks involved in this process that even though they were sad to see this piece go, the overall legislation was too important to let it get tripped up over this one element. And in the end, it did include something kind of along similar lines that would help flag behavioral threats, but, not the same sweeping database that lawmakers have still expressed interest in getting back to when they return next session. And I'll say also Democrats did not walk away from this totally satisfied either, even though they voted for the package in large numbers, and they were upset that nothing had been done to address firearms, including a safe firearms storage bill that would have incentivized the purchase of gun safes and safety training classes. That legislation did not make it through this year after another session of trying.
Hey, Sam, let's talk about one final theme, and that's Governor Kemp. And he really flexed his political muscle when it came to the legislation to curb civil lawsuits. You've also heard it called tort reform or lawsuit reform. And I don't think we're done covering the fallout and the impacts of this story.
Well, first, let's talk about the policy angle here. This rewrite of civil litigation rules in Georgia has the possibility of impacting any Georgian who ends up involved in a civil lawsuit on either side. And one of the big questions that was part of this debate was whether this rewrite of laws would bring down the cost of insurance premiums in Georgia. And so that is one thing that we'll be keeping really close eyes on over the coming months and in the coming years. And then, yes, as you nodded to, there are also political ramifications here. In the House especially, 8 Republicans voted no, 3 Democrats voted yes, so you have people breaking with their party. And I'll be curious to watch if there are ramifications for them when it comes to the ballot box or, just having political power within their parties.
And let me jump on that point. Beyond Governor Kemp making the decision on whether he's going to run for Senate in 2026, the other thing I want to see with Governor Kemp is, will he again get involved in state house races, specifically those 8 that voted against tort reform? And is he going to back a primary challenger, or is he going to put money in those races?
So, Rahul, let's talk about what happens in the next month or so.
So, bill signings. I don't think people realize there are hundreds of bills. You and I, what do we cover? Dozens? tops of bills throughout a 40-day session. There are hundreds of bills that are on the governor's desk or about to get on the governor's desk. He has until May 14th to sign them, veto them, or not take any action. And if he does that, those bills become law anyway.
We already had one high-profile bill signing. That was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And part of this could have been to avoid weeks of lobbying from opponents, hearing messages like, tell Kemp to vote no on SB 36, etc. So I wonder, how often, Rahul, does Kemp actually veto a bill?
You had to ask Sam. I was going to go find the numbers on this. Last year, he vetoed 12 bills. In 2023, he vetoed 14 bills. Again, this is a very small percentage of the hundreds of bills that are sent to him. And Sam, sometimes he vetoes bills for legal reasons. Sometimes he, vetoes them because there was a lack of funding, like legislation gets passed, but there was no funding for it. Even, Sam, there's this weird scenario where sometimes even the sponsor asks for a veto for one reason or another.
And the news does not stop with the end of session. Just a couple of other things I want to note before we get out of here. On Saturday, thousands of people took to the streets in downtown Atlanta and other cities in Georgia and around the country to protest the actions of President Trump. I ran into the march on Piedmont Avenue in Midtown.
And of course, this week we've been watching the stock market seesaw as President Trump's trade war escalates. Last week, we brought you some of the voices of lawmakers worried about tariffs. Look, Georgia is a top exporter of timber, poultry, pecans, cotton. The Port of Brunswick moves hundreds of thousands of vehicles in and out of the U.S. every year. So this matters to Georgia.
And this week we heard from Governor Kemp, who says people should feel more calm once Trump walked back his most recent, most sweeping tariffs and is instead focusing on dialing up the pressure on China.
I hear every day from companies where these moves may have benefited them and others it may have hurt. And so I think the steps they took today to really go after China and try to cut a deal with them, get them to come to the table, was a good move.
And Sam, while the legislative session is over, there is so much to cover. We're going to help y'all stay on top of it right here on Plugged In.
That's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Hellman.
Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. If you listen on demand, make sure to head on over to the Plugged In feed to subscribe, leave us a rating, and a review.
You can also find us on the radio at 90.1 every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10. If you've got a question that you want answered on the show, write us at tellus@wabe.org.
We'll be back next week.